August 26, 1944. The summer heat across the French countryside was suffocating, thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, burning rubber, and the metallic dust of a retreating German army. The United States Third Army was not just advancing. It was engaged in one of the most violent, rapid, and logistically impossible armored pursuits in the history of human warfare. General George S. Patton had unleashed his mechanized divisions after the breakout at Normandy, and his absolute, unyielding doctrine of speed was currently tearing the German military hierarchy into pieces. For Patton, speed was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a religion. According to the after-action reports and the strategic doctrines preserved in the archives of the United States Army War College, Patton believed with a terrifying certainty that every single minute his tanks spent sitting still was a minute that the enemy was using to dig trenches, zero their artillery, and prepare to kill American boys. Time was not an abstract concept for the Third Army. Time was measured entirely in American blood. And on this specific afternoon, in a small, historically irrelevant French provincial town on the road toward the German border, that doctrine of relentless, unforgiving speed was about to collide head-on with the absolute, unbending stubbornness of local European bureaucracy. What happened in the center of that town is not just a story about a traffic jam. It is a profound, incredibly revealing masterclass in the difference between the civilian illusion of authority and the terrifying reality of military necessity. Type the word momentum in the comments right now if you already understand that in warfare, pausing to celebrate is usually the fastest way to get your people killed, because what you are about to hear is going to permanently change the way you view the brutal, unsentimental reality of military command. To understand the full weight of this confrontation, you have to understand exactly what was happening on the roads of France in late August of 1944. The German Wehrmacht, an army that had terrorized the European continent for years, was in a state of chaotic, disorganized retreat. But a retreating German army was incredibly dangerous. If you gave them even 12 hours of breathing room, they would find a choke point, position their devastating 88mm anti-tank guns, and turn the next town into a slaughterhouse. Patton understood this better than any commander in the Allied forces. His orders to his armored column commanders were absolute and terrifyingly simple. You do not stop for rations. You do not stop to sleep. You do not stop to secure your flanks. You drive forward until your engines seize, until you run out of fuel, or until the enemy destroys you. The Third Army was moving with such unprecedented ferocity that the American supply lines, the famous Red Ball Express, were fracturing just trying to keep the fuel trucks catching up to the vanguard. But as the American Sherman tanks rumbled through the French countryside, they encountered a problem that no military manual had properly prepared them to face. They encountered the overwhelming, suffocating gratitude and the deeply ingrained bureaucratic ego of the newly liberated French civilian authorities. For 4 years, the people of France had lived under the iron boot of Nazi occupation. Their mayors, their local officials, and their magistrates had been stripped of their dignity, forced to bow to German officers, and humiliated in their own towns. When the Americans arrived, bringing liberation and freedom, the natural, human instinct of the French people was to celebrate. They wanted to pour wine, they wanted to kiss the soldiers, they wanted to hand out flowers, and most importantly, the local politicians wanted to reassert their authority. They wanted to stand in the town squares, wearing their official tricolor sashes, and deliver long, formal, grandiloquent speeches welcoming the American liberators and reclaiming their civic pride. In a world at peace, this is a beautiful thing. In the middle of an armored pursuit, it is a catastrophic tactical hazard. The lead elements of an American armored division were grinding their way toward a vital river crossing. The tanks were covered in the white dust of the roads. The crews were exhausted, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, their eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the inevitable ambush. As the vanguard approached a narrow, centuries-old cobblestone intersection in the center of a small French town, the column suddenly ground to a halt. The screech of the tank treads echoed off the stone buildings, followed by the deep, idling rumble of the massive engines. The young American tank commander, a lieutenant who had fought his way through the hedgerows of Normandy, popped his hatch and looked out, expecting to see a German roadblock, a destroyed bridge, or a hastily constructed anti-tank obstacle. What he saw instead was the mayor of the town. According to the historical accounts documented by the veterans of the Third Army and referenced in the exhaustive military biographies of General Patton, the mayor was standing dead center in the middle of the narrow road. He was fully dressed in his formal civic attire, a brilliant tricolor sash wrapped proudly around his chest. Behind him stood the local police, a brass band holding their instruments, and a massive crowd of cheering, weeping civilians. But the mayor was not just there to wave. He had ordered a heavy wooden barricade, a farm cart, and several large pieces of furniture dragged across the intersection. He was holding up his hand in a gesture of absolute, unyielding civic authority. The young American lieutenant, whose brain was wired for the brutal simplicity of combat, was completely paralyzed by the complexity of the situation. He was an American. He was a liberator. The military doctrine of the United States Army was built on the foundation of liberating the oppressed, not bullying them. He could not simply open fire on a crowd of cheering civilians, and he could not comprehend the idea of running over the elected official of an allied nation. He ordered his driver to cut the engine. He climbed down from the tank and approached the mayor, attempting to explain, through broken French and desperate hand gestures, that the column could not stop, that there were German divisions escaping just a few miles ahead, that they had to secure the bridge before it was wired with explosives. The mayor refused to yield. According to the translated accounts of the incident, the mayor had two distinct demands. First, he demanded that the American forces halt and participate in a formal liberation ceremony, complete with speeches, the playing of the national anthems, and the ceremonial drinking of the town's finest hidden wine. Second, and perhaps more absurdly in the context of total war, he was deeply concerned about the heavy, steel treads of the American Sherman tanks destroying the historic cobblestone streets of his beautiful town. He insisted that the tanks shut off their engines, and that the Americans figure out a way to route their heavy armor around the town's perimeter, a detour that would cost the armored column hours of precious, irreplaceable time. The mayor was operating under the illusion of performed authority. He believed that his sash, his title, and the moral righteousness of his newly reclaimed freedom granted him the power to dictate the terms of reality to a mechanized army. He believed that because the Americans were the good guys, they were bound by the polite, civilized rules of peacetime diplomacy. He believed that the war could simply be paused for an afternoon so that he could have his moment in the sun. The young lieutenant was trapped. The entire armored column, stretching for miles back down the country road, came to a standstill. Engines idled. Radios crackled with confused chatter. The momentum, the sacred, violent momentum of the Third Army, was bleeding out into the French dirt. And then, a siren wailed in the distance. It was not the deep, rhythmic siren of a fire engine. It was the high-pitched, screaming, furious wail of a custom-rigged command jeep tearing up the shoulder of the road, throwing dirt and gravel into the ditches as it bypassed the stalled column of armor. Every soldier in the Third Army knew that sound. It was the sound of impending, absolute terror. It was General George S. Patton. Patton arrived at the front of the column like a localized weather event. His jeep slammed to a halt, the tires smoking on the cobblestones. According to the memoirs of the soldiers who served under him, Patton in the field was a terrifying sight. He wore a highly polished helmet adorned with 3 gleaming silver stars. His uniform was immaculate, utterly unbothered by the dust of the road, and strapped to his waist, hanging low like a gunfighter from the old American West, were his famous ivory-handled revolvers. He did not step out of the jeep, he launched himself out of it. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not look at the cheering crowd. He did not look at the brass band. He looked only at the stalled lead tank and the young lieutenant standing helplessly in front of it. Patton demanded to know, in language that was so incredibly profane that the military censors later had to redact the official logs, why the hell the vanguard of the United States Third Army was sitting still while the enemy was getting away. The terrified lieutenant pointed to the mayor. He explained that the mayor was refusing to clear the barricade, that the town wanted a parade, and that the mayor was worried about the tanks tearing up the roads. Patton turned his gaze upon the mayor. You have to understand the psychological collision happening in this exact moment. The French mayor, wrapped in his sash, puffed up with the pride of local bureaucracy, representing the slow, ceremonial, deeply entrenched traditions of European civil administration. And standing opposite him was General George S. Patton, a man who believed he was the reincarnated soul of ancient warriors, a man who commanded the most destructive mechanized force on the planet, a man who calculated the value of human life strictly by how fast it could move toward the enemy. The mayor, completely oblivious to the danger he was in, stepped forward. He began to speak. He began to deliver his grand, eloquent speech about liberty, fraternity, and the historic preservation of his town's infrastructure. He expected Patton, the senior officer present, to recognize his authority. He expected the formal protocols of international diplomacy to take effect. He expected the general to salute, listen patiently, and perhaps negotiate a compromise that would satisfy the honor of the town. Patton did not salute. He did not wait for the translator. He did not negotiate. According to the accounts of the officers present, Patton walked directly up to the mayor, entirely ignoring the barricade, the police, and the crowd. He leaned in so close that the brim of his helmet nearly touched the mayor's face. Patton did not speak French, but the tone of his voice, the terrifying, high-pitched, raspy bark that defined his command style, transcended all language barriers. He pointed a leather-gloved finger directly at the mayor's chest. Patton told the mayor, through his terrified interpreter, that he had exactly 30 seconds to clear the barricade, clear the band, and get his people off the street. The mayor, shocked by the profound disrespect, attempted to argue. He pointed at his sash. He pointed at the historic cobblestones. He repeated his demand that the tanks find another route so as not to damage the town. Patton's response is one of the most brilliant, uncompromising moments of command clarity in the history of the war. He turned his back on the mayor, completely dismissing his existence. He looked up at the young American tank commander who was standing in the turret of the lead Sherman. Patton pointed at the barricade, the farm carts, and the mayor who was standing directly in front of them. He delivered an order that shattered the civilian illusion of authority in an instant. "Lieutenant," Patton barked, his voice echoing over the quiet crowd, "if this son of a bitch is not out of the way in 30 seconds, you will put your tank in gear. You will drive right through that barricade, and you will crush him into his own goddamn cobblestones. Do not stop until you reach the Rhine." The young lieutenant swallowed hard. He looked at Patton. He looked at the mayor. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Patton was not bluffing. The general would have him court-martialed and shot for cowardice if he disobeyed. The lieutenant dropped down into the turret. He put his headset on. The massive engines of the Sherman tank roared to life, a deafening, terrifying sound of raw industrial violence. The tank jerked forward, the steel treads grinding into the historic stones, blowing a cloud of black diesel smoke into the air. The mayor stood his ground for exactly 3 seconds. He watched the 30-ton machine of war lurch toward him. He looked at the face of General Patton, who was standing on the sidewalk, his hand resting casually on the butt of his ivory-handled revolver, watching the scene with eyes that held absolutely zero sympathy, zero patience, and zero regard for local politics. In that split second, the mayor realized the fundamental truth of the universe that all bureaucracies eventually discover when they encounter real power. His sash meant nothing. His speech meant nothing. His authority was a polite fiction that only existed because men like Patton allowed it to exist. And right now, Patton was no longer allowing it. The mayor broke. He turned and sprinted toward the sidewalk, abandoning the barricade, abandoning his dignity, and waving frantically for the brass band and the police to scatter. The crowd panicked, parting like the Red Sea as the American tank slammed into the farm carts, shattering the wood into splinters, crushing the furniture beneath its treads, and tearing the historic cobblestones out of the earth as it accelerated through the intersection. Patton did not even smile. He simply watched the lead tank pass, then turned, climbed back into his jeep, and ordered his driver to push forward. The column was moving again. The momentum was restored. The blood of the Third Army was no longer spilling on the altar of French bureaucracy. When you hear this story, it is very easy for a modern mind, sitting in the comfort of a peaceful society, to view Patton as a tyrant. It is easy to look at his actions and call him arrogant, brutal, or disrespectful to a liberated ally. But if you are going to understand history, you have to look at it through the lens of the men who had to bear the crushing weight of its consequences. Patton was not being cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was operating on a level of moral arithmetic that the civilian mayor could not possibly comprehend. Every single hour that the Third Army was delayed by a parade meant that a German panzer division 50 miles away had an extra hour to refuel. It meant that a German artillery crew had an extra hour to lay mines on the bridge that the Americans needed to cross. It meant that when the vanguard finally arrived at their objective, they would not find an unprepared, retreating enemy. They would find a fortified, entrenched meat grinder. Patton knew that if he allowed that mayor to stop his tanks for an afternoon of drinking wine and listening to speeches, 50 American boys would die the next morning trying to cross a river that they could have taken without a fight if they had just kept moving. Patton sacrificed the feelings, the dignity, and the historic cobblestones of one French town in order to save the lives of the men he was responsible for. He understood that the only true mercy in warfare is speed. The faster you kill the enemy, the faster you break their will to fight, the faster the war ends, and the faster everyone gets to go home. Ceremonies, parades, and bureaucratic protocols are luxuries that are paid for with the lives of the infantry, and Patton refused to pay that price. The incident with the French mayor is not just a funny anecdote about an angry general. It is a defining illustration of what actual leadership looks like when the stakes are absolute. The mayor was performing leadership. He was playing a role, wearing a costume, and expecting the world to conform to his script. Patton was exercising leadership. He saw the objective, he saw the obstacle, and he applied the exact amount of necessary force to remove the obstacle and protect his men. He did not care if history remembered him as a monster, as long as history remembered his men as the victors. This is the dark, unfiltered reality of how the Second World War was actually won. It was not won by polite negotiations or respectful adherence to civilian traditions. It was won by uncompromising, ruthless men who were willing to become terrifying in order to defeat something even worse. If this deep dive into the psychology of command and the brutal realities of the Allied advance gave you a perspective you've never considered before, hit that like button right now. We do not sugarcoat history on this channel. We look at the raw, uncomfortable facts that the textbooks gloss over. Subscribe to the channel and make sure your notifications are turned on, because we are going to keep pulling back the curtain on the most intense, heavily censored, and powerful stories of the men who forged the modern world in fire. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have ordered the tanks to drive through the barricade to save your men, or would you have stopped to honor the mayor? I read every single comment, and I will see you in the next one.